I'm Jim Latola. I'm a trustee for the Northeast Oakland County Historical Society. Today we're coming from the museum to bring a new episode of Oxford History Today. We've brought up the idea of bringing up some of Oxford's original pioneers,
right.
in keeping with a recent cemetery tour we had, so other people can hear the stories of old Oxford.
Yeah, I think that cemetery tour piqued everybody's interest on how we really got started here in the community with the families, which was when, in the 1830s?
In the early 1830s is when the families began to arrive. And being the first episode talking about the pioneers, I thought it would be appropriate if we talked about the Demmings, who were the first permanent residents of Oxford Township.
Which actually, they came up here. He came from New York, wasn't it?
Correct. He came from New York. Actually, he came from, originally he came from New Hampshire.
Oh, right.
And as a young man in his teens, he was married and his wife died, and he was grieving her death, and he decided to go west to get away from everything. And he made it as far as Chile Center in Monroe County, New York, where he stopped for a few years before he was continuing his trip west to Michigan. And of course, it was there in New York where he met his second wife, Sally.
Mrs. Demmings. And so they stayed there for a couple years, and then they ended. What made him want to come to Michigan, do you know?
It's not real clear. I think it was his original intent to come west, but it's one of those mysteries. When you research the history about people coming west to Michigan, you find there's usually about 3 different ways they came. One of the ways was they came themselves and kind of surveyed the land to see what it was like, purchased land, and then went back for their families and brought their families west. Some of them had friends or relatives that had moved to Michigan who wrote back about the opportunities in Michigan, and they decided to move to Michigan. And there were some that were just land speculators. They knew the value of the land, they knew they could resell it and make some money, so they bought the land and then they resold it as the prices went up and the land became more valuable.
That was obviously after the word spread that it was nothing but swampland, right?
Right, yeah.
So he actually purchased property here before he even married his second wife? Is that how that went with him?
He was still in Chillicothe Center, New York, when he purchased, and that's one of the mysteries, because you find when you hear the story that when he finally does get to his land, there's a man there by the name of Avery Brown. And the family oral tradition tells him that he knew Mr. Brown from New York. So the question is when he purchased the land, did he come to Michigan himself and purchase it? Or perhaps Mr. Brown acted as an agent for him and purchased the land and then was on the land when he finally got here.
Sight unseen, probably, huh?
Right. And so it's kind of a mystery because I find it kind of unusual that he'd come to the wilderness, and of the whole wilderness, he would run into an acquaintance from where he was in New York.
Yeah, that is. So somehow they were shaking hands somewhere along the line.
Right.
They did not, the Demmings, he and his wife did not actually come directly to Oxford either, did they?
No, like most families, they first came to Detroit and then they settled in Pontiac. They had a daughter who was born in New York. When they were living in Pontiac, a son was born. And then that's when Mr. Demmings comes from Pontiac on foot to survey his land that he apparently had not seen before, and then that's where in the family tradition he finds Mr. Brown in the cedar swamp by his land where he's built a shack out in the swamp, and he's trapping and he's cutting shingles for the new pioneers that are sure to arrive. So
wow, so they had confidence that other people were going to be here, but yet there were Native Americans in this area at that time, correct?
Oh, sure. And there's the beautiful thing about the Deming family is, we have a lot of families that settled the area, but we don't have the day-to-day stories of some of the things that happened when they came. And Mr. and Mrs. Demming's granddaughter, Helen, gave a presentation to the Oakland County Pioneer and Historical Society, and here at the museum we have a transcript of that presentation, which includes many of the oral traditions or the stories told down through the Deming family.
Wow. Okay.
And at that time, when they built their cabin, they were on the Territorial Road. which really followed the Indian Trail. The Territorial Road came from Rochester and went up to Lapeer, and it roughly followed Orion Road, M24, and then Metamora Road up to Lapeer. And actually, the Territorial Road pretty much followed an original Indian Trail.
Okay.
So.
And so is that how he made it up here from Pontiac? Was there a trail that he also
There was another
followed?
Indian Trail coming up from Pontiac that came up to the Oxford area, and of course there were very few settlers at that time. You still had to worry about the wildlife. There was bears and wolves, and there's even some reports of cougars. So, and you know, though things were peaceful with the Indians and they weren't hostile, people were still generally a little shy and a little concerned about them.
Right.
Yeah.
I imagine coming from the area that he came from, which had been settled for years and years and years, that probably was a really new experience for them to be able to live amongst the Native Americans that lived here. I know that I read one story that there was a group of Native Americans in the Lakeville area, around the lake there, that actually taught the settlers how to make baskets, etc. So it does sound like that they were pretty friendly.
It does, for the most part. In fact, there's a lot of accounts. Even Mr. Demming, there's a family story about him digging a well, and he's doing it with the assistance of an Indian.
Oh, wow.
And while they're working on the well, the Indian drinks a little too much whiskey, and he mentions to Mr. Demming that the white men would be planting the crops, but the Indians would be harvesting them, which, of course, led to some mistrust of the Indians, too, because they weren't sure what the situation would be come fall.
Also, he might have thought that they were going to take whatever the harvest was.
Right. And you have to remember, too, it hadn't been that long since the War of 1812 when the Indians, particularly Chief Tecumseh, had sided with the British in the attack on Detroit. So, you know, that's just one generation away. So I'm sure there were stories of the mistreatment on both sides, both the Indian and on the part of the whites from back then. So I'm sure those were in the back of everybody's mind of what occurred in recent history.
Right. I can remember something that happened 20 years ago like it was yesterday. So that was 20 years prior to them coming here. No, right. So then they actually settled out in that cedar swamp, which is now Thomas, right? It was not actually Oxford proper?
Well, no, where their home would have been roughly near the intersection of M24 and Metamora Road, the second intersection.
Oh, okay. Oh, where our studio's at, okay.
Yeah, up past that,
Yeah, okay.
where Metamora Road crosses again, it would have been there. And in fact, there's one of the things mentioned, they were a family of many first because they were the first family here. And they erected the first schoolhouse. And when you see that schoolhouse, they attribute that to being erected at the four corners, which would be the intersection of Metamora Road and Oakwood Road.
Really? Wow. That's fascinating. And so that was the first schoolhouse built by them, but that wasn't the only thing he did for this community, correct?
Right. Well, and I always like the Demming story, and what I find particularly interesting is that they opened their homes to everybody. Anybody came to the area, whether they were looking for a property or they were traveling through and needed a night stay, they would invite them into their home. And even Mr. and Mrs. Demming, they say that they tried to treat the Indians even with respect because the Indians were still traveling on the trail. And when they would stop, they would try to treat them like they would other people going through. Maybe not welcome into the home, but extend some hospitality to them.
Feed them or...
Right.
That's pretty fascinating.
There is one account where Mr. Demming got into an argument of a band of about 10 Indians as they were coming through, and one of the Indians pointed his flintlock rifle at Mr. Demming, pulled the trigger, and the gun misfired. And he was so upset at that, he ran into the log cabin to get his own firearm, and only Sally held the gun down and prevented him from going outside and taking on all 10 Indians, and then by the time he did go out, they had left the area.
Wow. Well, he was a lucky man, wasn't he? Yeah. And that could have started something terrible in this area. Wow, if he would have taken them on. We are not done talking about what happened with the Deming family and how Oxford got started. So stay with us. We're going to be right back.
continuing with the Demmings, because they were the first family that actually lived in the area, they had many firsts that they're being credited for. I mentioned that they had the first school up at the Four Corners up from their house. Their third child born, their daughter, was the first white child born in the area.
Oh, that's interesting.
When Dr. Pliny and Dr. Burdick came into the area, they established their first practice, so they would have had the first medical doctors at Demmings Corners.
Oh. Is that what it was originally called? Was
Well,
Demmings
people
Corners?
referred to it as Demmings Corners and Demmingsville, and there were a couple names that never really took. But like I said, they were credited with many firsts just because they were the first residents. In addition to that first school, they had the first church services were held in that school. He was the first postmaster in the area. He had the post office in his house, so people would come to his home to mail letters or pick up their mail. We had a little conversation. The granddaughter refers to a letter as costing 25 cents to mail a letter, which in those times would have been very, very expensive. So we had a discussion whether that could be an accurate number, and I went to the United States Postal Service website, and I looked it up, and sure enough, the cost of a letter could be 25 cents, but the postage was based on how far the letter was to go. So a letter that cost 25 cents was a letter that was going over 400 miles. As the distance decreased, the postage decreased on the letter. So mailing a letter back east to let the family know how you were doing or what the opportunities were for a family in the wilderness, 25 cents I'm sure was a pretty expensive idea. So
they didn't do it that often, I'm sure, number one. And
right.
Number two, how do you suppose that was delivered? Did they take it by pony down to Detroit and then ship?
Well, I'm sure it would have all been by horseback. It had to have been done by horseback at that time for there to be any speed to it.
Probably still took a couple months to get
sure,
there.
and you think of a trip of 400 miles, it was somewhat probably like the Pony Express, where there was a number of riders that carried them from one town to another until it finally got to its destination. But another first the Demmings had is they had the first kind of public meeting in the area. They had a meeting at their home. And that was where all their neighbors got together, and they wanted to form Oxford Township. So it was an official township meeting, but it was the first meeting of its kind held in the area with the idea of becoming Oxford Township.
Wow. So at this point, that meeting was still at the Four Corners at the Demmings house?
At the Demmings home.
So we didn't have downtown proper yet?
That's correct.
Okay.
And really, the Demmings had been the center of activity. You know, they had welcomed people to the community. Like I said, they had welcomed people into their home and people to stay. So for many years, it was the center of activity. And their family continued to grow. They had 3 more children while living there. Other prominent people from the area were moving here. But slowly, Oxford Corners started to grow. And I'm not sure really of the explanation other than the intersecting road, but perhaps there was more traffic on the 2 intersecting roads. And so the business activity kind of shifted away from Deming's home to the Oxford, what they called Oxford Corners. And really Oxford existed because of that intersection of the 2 roads. Almost everything was built along the Territorial Road or along what is now Burdick Street. There weren't any additions to the village at that time, so everything was built around the Four Corners. So it began to grow and things began to quiet at the Demmings, but Mr. Demmings remained involved in a lot of public and civic affairs. He was a township supervisor. I think he may have held several township offices at different times. He was involved in the establishment of the first Oxford Academy or Oxford School, which had existed prior to the public schools. It was actually taken over by the public schools, but it was the first graded school in the area. So he was a founding member and trustee of that. So he remained actively involved, but Demmings Corners or Demmingsville just kind of quietly faded from memory. And I think it's kind of unusual because a lot of the other prominent citizens of the time, you see things named after them.
Like Gordonville.
Yeah.
There's Still
or
famous
even
Orton.
landmarks around here. We have
Oh, yeah,
Powell
right.
Lake, and we have streets named after some of our
That's right. A lot of our
first.
streets.
Most of the roads, are named after early pioneers.
Sure.
And it's kind of unusual to me that Demmings kind of seem to be forgotten because there's nothing you can really attribute their name to that's still in the community, even though they were the first family here.
Isn't that funny? Well, I think they were giving people, obviously, they really did for a community. They probably were okay with sitting on the sidelines as far as all the grandeur of having a community named after you or a street or... I'd like to believe that anyhow, romantically, that they just were happy to support the community and not take all the credit for it.
And I think, I guess why I find it unusual is they had to be really, really well known. I mean, basically everybody in the community had to know them.
Sure.
And maybe it was because they were so prominent, nobody even just really thought about it. Yes.
So it became Oxford at that time then?
It converted to Oxford, and as Oxford began to grow, the post office was moved to the Powell House Hotel, or Powell Tavern here in town, so he was no longer postmaster. The mail wasn't delivered to his house, so people weren't coming to the house for mail. There were other schoolhouses built, so that wasn't the only schoolhouse in the area. There were other church congregations formed, so that was no longer the only church in the area. So as it grew, Demmings kind of became the quieter corner of town as things came to Oxford Corners.
And isn't that funny? You would think because they had so many children, they would have gotten involved and took a huge role of some sort in the community, opened a hotel or something.
And you have to remember, too, they had several daughters, so the daughters continued. In fact, the granddaughter that left us the transcript of the oral tradition from the family, she was married to Mr. John C. Moyer, so the Moyer is a prominent name in the family.
Sure.
So the Demmings are there, but it's just not, the name isn't necessarily tied to the community anymore.
Now, you told me initially when we were at the cemetery that there was another really prominent name that Mr. Demmings actually was like one of the second families here that he helped. Was it Dr. Burdick or?
Well, he helped Dr. Burdick, but right across the road from him was Mr. Axford.
Oh, that's
and Mr. Axford, his father had settled that family in the Rochester area and were prominent in politics. And when the Axford family moved here, they were also prominent in politics. So you had two important founders of the community almost living across the street from each other by coincidence, really, more than anything. And so, as I said, everything just kind of moved to Oxford, and the Deming Home kind of became family, and the name kind of faded from history, and you just don't hear it or know about it. And
now that home is not still standing, is it?
No, but if you look at the maps on the wall, you'll see where there were a number of parcels of land still in the late 1800s that were owned by family members. Yeah, and if you look in that area of Metamora Road to Oakwood Road, you'll see there's a fair amount of acreage that's still owned by members of the Deming family.
Really? Now that's for people that aren't quite that familiar. That's where the Glider Airport building is still standing, right? In that area?
No, it was more along Metamora Road, but moving south from Oakwood Road, rather than on M24.
Okay. So inland a little bit.
Right.
From 24. Got it. And they were here, the people then came up here because of the agricultural benefits to the community? Is that what made this community grow?
Oh, sure. It was a farming community. Oxford Corners, as that developed, even the businesses here were basically made to cater to farmers. So it was to provide the things that farmers needed. And so the Deming family continued, but they continued to prosper. And
that's good to hear. Again, we've already walked through this section of this program. It's so interesting to talk to you. I really appreciate that. And we'll be right back.
Canine Stray Rescue is Oxford's own local dog rescue. Each year they take in hundreds of dogs and bring them into suitable homes. certified nonprofit organization, Canine Dog Rescue strives to give pound dogs a new leash on life. To donate, adopt, or even volunteer, call them at 248-628-0435 or go to their website, dogsaver.org, and click on the Canine Stray Rescue League link.
So the Deming family really, they prospered, though it was quiet. Mrs. Demming talks about they reached the point in their life where they were able to afford to go back east and visit their friends and relatives. And they traveled on the Erie Canal boats to get back to New York. And she said that in all their travels and going back and seeing friends and relatives, they never thought twice about not having come to Oxford, that Oxford was their home, and they were always happy that they had made that choice.
Wow.
And Mr. Demming died in about 1860, but Mrs. Demming went on quite a few years after that. I think 34 years beyond.
Oh my goodness.
That. So she's up into 1894. Mrs. Demming was
So she was 60
still alive.
years in this community.
Right.
Wow.
And like I said, some of the children or the daughters had married other prominent people in the area, so you don't necessarily see the Demming name. And as that happened, Oxford continued to grow too. And as I said, it was built basically along the four corners. Some of the businesses started. Mr. Powell built the Powell Tavern, which was the Powell Hotel. Dr. Burdick moved his practice down to Oxford, so he had his practice. His home was on West Burdick, where he had a large hall building which had a retail store on the bottom and legal offices on the second floor, and then he had like a community hall on the third floor that could accommodate a number of citizens. Other businesses came, and like I said, most of them were catering to the farmer, whatever the farmer needed. You had blacksmiths, and you had even a little foundry that would make farm implements to sell to the farmers. So a lot of the implements, even that the farmers
that they needed,
they were manufactured locally.
Oh, wow.
And so Oxford continued that way until well after the Civil War, and what really kind of made Oxford take off was when the railroads came to town. And that's what made the really big difference. That's when you had some manufacturing come, and the farmers could more easily get their products to market.
Oh, yeah.
When you read about the old accounts about the original pioneers, that transporting things to market was a real problem.
Yeah.
And I find it's really interesting. There's a book that was published in, I believe it was 1878 or 1888 on Oakland County history. And you read some of those original accounts, what a lot of the farmers did was they turned their grain, they had their own stills, and they would turn their grain into spirits, and then they would sell the spirits because it could be more easily transported.
Right.
And that it was more easily to convert that to cash than it was the grain itself. So when you read about the original accounts, even of the forming of the Oakland County government, there's a story about where everybody gets a little too intoxicated at a meeting at a mill in Pontiac, and it leads to some hijinks that embarrass the community. But
That'd be interesting to read. They sure don't do that now.
Well, it is an interesting book to read. It's available at the library. They do have a copy there. They don't leave it out on the shelf. They're becoming somewhat rare, but it's an interesting book to read just because at the time, again, like the story about the Demmings, the stories are presented from what have been an oral tradition of the stories that happened before. So depending on the person's telling the story, you can get a little flavor for some of the people have real good senses of humor, and they kind of put in some double entendres and other things as you read, and it's a really entertaining book to read.
Now, it's called what? The History of Oakland County?
The History of Oakland County. And this escapes me the name of the author now, but it's an interesting book.
And our Oxford Library carries it.
The Oxford Library does carry
nice.
it, and you can read it in the library. But it's interesting because of the oral tradition, and many of the things about Oxford Township, in that book is how each of the township governments were formed also. So there are many details about Oxford Township itself also in the book. But That's the problem. A lot of the early settlers, they didn't leave a record of those early stories. And that's why we're fortunate with the museum here, because some of the families have deposited their family histories here, and some of the stories that have been the oral tradition in their families, where you can hear about their hardships and the good things and the bad things, and about life in Oxford when it was the wilderness, and carving a life out of the wilderness and building up their farms, and some of them just absolutely thriving.
And so you did, I could read every one of those books and I still wouldn't get enough information, but you mentioned the Axfords. What did they do to gain such a name in this community?
Well, Mr. Axford had served in almost every public office that had to do with the township government. And then he was elected to the state legislature, and after serving in the state legislature, he also served in the state senate for a number of years. And what's remarkable about Mr. Axford is he had grown up in a rural area of Shelby Township, in the early 1800s, and they didn't really even have a public school, so he was in many ways self-taught or taught at home, almost like a homeschooling, and he had learned enough to take him to where he was able to hold prominent spots in the state government.
Yeah, he sure did then. And that's Daniel Axford?
Samuel.
That's Samuel. So his son must have been Daniel. Where do we get the Daniel Axford?
There's two Daniel Axfords.
Oh, really?
Samuel's brother Daniel Axford was killed in the Mexican War.
Oh, my goodness.
And that brought up the issue of slavery moving into the western lands, because after the Mexican War, we got Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, California, Arizona, all the western states became part of the U.S. So that's where the slavery raised again. Most people didn't want slavery to extend to those states. And Mr. Axford, being in the state legislature passed, they didn't have a direct vote in how the U.S. government would handle it, but they did pass a resolution to discourage the government from allowing those territories to become slave states, which of course a few years later led to the Civil War. So, like I said, a lot of times these people, even though they're prominent in Oxford history, in a way they're related to national history too.
That's really nice. We had quite a few prominent residents from Oxford that went to legislature and made a name for themselves. And we're going to have to talk about that sometime too. And we're going to have to talk about the Civil War sometime too, and who in our community served in the Civil War.
And I think the story of, I'm astonished how many Civil War veterans lived in Oxford at one time. They had the GAR post, and in the Oxford Cemetery there's more than 50 Civil War veterans buried in the Oxford Cemetery. So to me it's just amazing how many Civil War veterans were from this area. But there's many other people too that have a connection to national history. That's the local stories, but there's a lot of them that have a little connection with something in the national forefront that connects everything together. And I think that's what I find really interesting and fascinating, how they're kind of interwoven through national politics and history and local history and politics.
Good. So you keep studying up on those, and you educate the rest of us. This has been a fascinating experience so far. I love learning about the families that are names that we're so familiar with, like the Demmings. They have a prominent spot in the cemetery. In the old part of the cemetery.
In the old burying grounds.
Right.
Yes.
And then you're talking about the Axfords and the Moyers and the Burdicks, and it's so fascinating that they're the people that started our community. They're still part of our community. They are our community even now, from the 1830s. It's just fascinating. So you keep learning about the families in this community, and we'll keep hearing about them.
Okay.
It's been a great experience, and welcome back to Oxford History Today.
There's a lot of history to Oxford. Hidden around every corner, deep in every crack, and sometimes right in front of you, waiting to be discovered. If you just dig a little, you'll find the great history of our beautiful town. Welcome to historic Oxford.